The fog clung to the trees like a shroud, muffling the world in a gray silence that pressed against the skin. In the small town of Eldridge, nestled at the edge of the whispering woods, Sarah Jennings had always felt the pull of something unseen. It started with the old Polaroid she found tucked away in a dusty box in the garage, a simple snapshot of her and her two daughters, Lily and Grace, taken on a summer hike 5 years back. They stood smiling under the canopy, arms linked, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in dappled patterns. But lately, that photo had become something more, something that gnawed at the edges of her sanity. It was the hands that did it. In the image, their fingers intertwined in what seemed like a loving grip, but when Sarah looked closer one sleepless night, a chill slithered down her spine. The lines on their palms twisted unnaturally, forming shapes that didn't belong, subtle, vein-like patterns that pulsed with an almost rhythmic intent, as if echoing words too faint to hear. She dismissed it at first, blaming the dim light or her tired eyes, but the unease lingered, growing like roots in dark soil. Word spread after she posted the photo online, seeking reassurance from strangers. Just a glitch in the film, some said. But then the experts weighed in, photographers, forensics analysts, even a historian with a penchant for the occult. They zoomed in, enhanced, dissected every pixel. And what they found sent ripples through forums and late-night discussions. The hands weren't just distorted, they bore markings that defied explanation, alignments that matched no known anatomy, whispers of symmetry broken in ways that suggested interference from beyond the frame. Sarah couldn't shake the dreams that followed. In them, the woods came alive with voices, low, murmuring tones that slithered through the underbrush, calling names she half remembered from childhood tales. Lily and Grace heard them too, though they tried to hide it, their faces paling at the dinner table when the wind howled outside. The girls' hands itched inexplicably, as if the photo's secret had seeped into their flesh. And as the autumn leaves began to fall, stripping the trees bare, Sarah knew they had to return to that spot in the woods, where the air grew thick and the ground seemed to hum with buried secrets. The voices were waiting, patient and hungry, ready to reveal what had truly been captured that day, not just a family, but the beginning of something that clawed its way out of the dark. The attic smelled of old paper and forgotten summers, a stale sweetness that clung to the back of the throat. Sarah had come up here on a whim, chasing the vague restlessness that had settled into her bones over the past few weeks. Boxes lined the narrow floorboards like silent sentinels, their cardboard edges softened by years of quiet decay. She pulled one down at random, a plain brown thing labeled in her own hurried handwriting, Miscellaneous Photos, 2020 to 2021. The tape gave way with a soft tearing sound, and inside lay a loose jumble of prints, Polaroids mostly, their glossy surfaces dulled by time. She lifted them one by one, half smiling at the captured moments, Lily at 7, gap-toothed and triumphant beside a lopsided sandcastle, Grace asleep on the porch swing, one small hand curled against her cheek. Then her fingers brushed against a thicker card, cooler than the others. She drew it out slowly. The photograph was larger than the rest, a crisp 4x6 taken on real film, the kind you had to wait days to develop. In it, the three of them stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the towering pines of Black Hollow Woods, the same woods that bordered their property and stretched unbroken for miles. The light was golden, late afternoon, slanting through the branches in long, honey-colored spears. Sarah remembered the day clearly enough, a spontaneous walk after a rain, the air still damp and smelling of wet earth, the girls laughing as they raced ahead to find the perfect fallen log for a seat. In the image, they were posed deliberately, almost formally. Sarah in the center, arms around both daughters, her smile wide and unguarded. Lily on the left, head tilted toward her mother, one hand resting lightly on Sarah's forearm. Grace on the right, mirroring her sister, fingers laced through Sarah's free hand. The grip looked tender, protective. Nothing unusual. Nothing that should have made her breath catch. But it did. She carried the photo downstairs into the kitchen, where the overhead light was merciless. Holding it under the bulb, she studied their hands again. The fingers were intertwined in a way that seemed almost too neat, too deliberate for a casual snapshot. The creases of their palms, the heart line, the life line, the faint tracery of fate, appeared to flow into one another, merging at the points of contact. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, but once seen, impossible to unsee. A single continuous pattern ran across all three sets of hands, as though the skin itself had been drawn together by an invisible thread. Not scars. Not shadows. Something more like writing, faint and pale, etched just beneath the surface. Sarah's pulse quickened. She turned the photo over. On the back, in faded blue ink, was a date scribbled in her own hand, July 17, 2020. Below it, a single word she did not remember writing: listen. She set the photograph down carefully, as if it might bite. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, a low, continuous sigh that sounded almost like breathing. For the first time in years, the woods felt closer than the backyard fence, closer than the walls of the house. And in the silence between gusts, she thought she heard something else, something very soft, very patient, murmuring her name from somewhere deep among the trees. The photograph had barely been online for 48 hours when the first messages arrived, polite at first, then insistent. Strangers with usernames like Pixel Forensics and Shadow Trace DM tagged Sarah in threads, asking if she'd noticed the anomaly. She hadn't posted seeking attention, she'd only wanted someone to tell her she was imagining things. Instead, the image spread like frost across glass, gathering momentum in niche forums dedicated to optical illusions, vintage photography glitches, and things that lingered just beyond rational explanation. By the third day, professionals had taken notice. A retired Kodak technician in Ohio reached out first, offering to run the scan through legacy enhancement software he still kept running on an old workstation. Then came the digital forensics specialist from a university lab in Boston, the kind who testified in court cases about manipulated evidence. A historian who specialized in mid-20th century occult photography contacted her through a mutual acquaintance, politely requesting higher resolution files. Even a dermatologist with a side interest in rare palm dermatoglyphics patterns asked for close-ups of the hands. Sarah, half-dazed, sent the originals, scans at 1200 dpi, untouched. They worked independently at first, trading notes in a private group chat that grew to 17 members. The consensus formed slowly, like sediment settling in still water. The hands were not distorted by lens flare, double exposure, or chemical fault in the film. The merging lines weren't artifacts of compression or editing software. Every layer of analysis confirmed the photograph was pristine, captured in a single exposure on analog stock. Yet the palms refused to obey ordinary anatomy. Under magnification, the heart lines, head lines, and life lines of all three subjects appeared to synchronize at the points of contact, forming a single, unbroken circuit that flowed from Sarah's palm into Lily's, then into Grace's, and back again in a perfect loop. The pattern repeated in miniature across the fingerprints, whirls and loops that echoed one another with impossible precision, as though the ridges had been pressed together while still forming in the womb. One analyst overlaid the palms digitally and watched the lines align like interlocking gears, each deviation mirrored exactly in the others. Another ran spectral analysis on the skin tones. The faint bluish undertone in the creases suggested something embedded, not surface level, like ink beneath the epidermis or a subcutaneous glow that film had somehow captured. The historian was the one who first voiced the word they'd all been avoiding: invocation. He pointed to grainy reproductions of 19th-century grimoires where summoning sigils were drawn as continuous hand-to-hand chains, meant to bind voices from unseen places. The forensics expert countered that it could be a rare genetic marker, a polydactyly echo or syndactyly remnant, but admitted no database held a match this symmetrical. The dermatologist simply said the skin looked active, as if the patterns had shifted between the moment of exposure and development. Sarah read their reports in the quiet hours after midnight, the house creaking around her. The experts weren't arguing anymore, they were marveling, unsettled, passing the image back and forth like a relic that refused to explain itself. And in every enhanced close-up, the hands seemed to stare back, their joined lines whispering of a connection forged not by blood alone, but by something older, something that had been listening in the woods that day. The first night after the experts' reports arrived, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark bedroom, the house settling around her with small, familiar creaks, but tonight each sound felt deliberate, like footsteps testing the floorboards. The photograph rested on the nightstand, face down, as though turning it over might invite something in. She told herself it was exhaustion, the cumulative weight of too many late-night scrolls through forum threads and email chains filled with technical jargon and cautious speculation. Yet when she closed her eyes, the joined lines of their palms flickered behind her lids like afterimages from staring too long at a bright light. Around 3 in the morning, the whispers began. They were faint at first, so soft she thought they might be the wind brushing the eaves or the furnace kicking on downstairs. But the house was still, no draft moved the curtains, and the heating had cycled off hours earlier. The sound came from outside, filtering through the closed window in thin, silvery threads. Not words exactly, more like breath shaped into intent, rising and falling in cadence that mimicked speech without ever quite forming it. Sarah sat up slowly, heart thudding against her ribs. She listened, straining, and the murmurs grew just clear enough to feel personal, as though someone standing at the tree line was calling her name in a voice she should recognize. She slipped out of bed, bare feet cold on the hardwood, and padded to the window. The backyard stretched toward the woods, moonlit grass giving way to black pine trunks that swallowed the light. Nothing moved. No silhouette, no glint of eyes. Yet the whispers continued, patient, threading through the branches like smoke. They tugged at her, gentle but insistent, urging her toward the place where the photograph had been taken, the narrow trail that branched off the main path, the clearing with the moss-covered log where the girls had sat giggling while she framed the shot. The next night it happened again, and the night after that. Always the same hour, always the same direction. Sarah began leaving the window cracked, telling herself she needed air, but really she wanted to hear more clearly. Fragments drifted in, her name, yes, but also, come, and listen, and something that sounded like, we waited. The voice, or voices, never rose above a murmur, yet they carried perfectly across the open ground, as though the woods themselves were speaking through cupped hands. Lily noticed first. One morning at breakfast the girl rubbed her temples and said the woods had been talking in her sleep. Grace nodded silently, eyes wide. Sarah tried to laugh it off, blame the wind or an owl, but the girls' faces told her they heard the same thing she did. And each time the whispers returned, they seemed a little closer, as if the speaker had taken a step forward from the dark between the trees, closing the distance night by night, drawing the family back toward the shadowed clearing where everything had first been bound. Grace was the first to break. It happened on a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind of gray day that bled into night without warning. She came downstairs after her bath, hair still damp, wearing the oversized sweatshirt that used to belong to her father. Sarah was at the kitchen table, staring at the photograph again, when Grace stopped in the doorway and said, very quietly, "Mom, I keep dreaming about the lady in the water." Sarah's hand froze on the edge of the print. She looked up slowly. Grace's face was pale, the skin around her eyes bruised, looking from lack of sleep. Lily appeared behind her sister a moment later, arms wrapped around herself as though the house had suddenly grown colder. The dreams had started small, Grace explained, fragments at first, like half-heard conversations through a wall. But over the past week they had sharpened into scenes that felt less like imagination and more like memory borrowed from someone else. In every dream, the woods were the same, the narrow trail, the mossy log, the clearing where the photograph had been taken. But there was always water nearby now, a shallow, black pond that hadn't existed 5 years ago when they hiked there, or perhaps had always been there and they simply hadn't noticed. The lady stood at the pond's edge. She was tall, too tall, her silhouette stretched thin against the trees. Her dress, or what looked like a dress, hung in wet folds, dripping steadily even though the ground beneath her feet was dry. Her face stayed turned away, but her hands were visible, long fingers, palms open, the same joined lines that ran across Sarah's, Lily's, and Grace's own hands etched deep into her skin, glowing faintly like veins filled with moonlight. She spoke without moving her lips. The words came from everywhere and nowhere, sinking into Grace's mind the way cold water soaks through clothes. They were pieces of a story the girls had never been told, a woman who walked into the woods one winter night in 1997, carrying nothing but a photograph of her own family. She had gone looking for her husband, who disappeared. The decision came on a Thursday when the whispers had grown so insistent that sleep became impossible for any of them. Sarah packed a small backpack with flashlights, water, a first aid kit, and the photograph itself, sealed now in a plastic sleeve like evidence in a case she no longer controlled. Lily and Grace followed her lead without protest, their faces set in the same quiet determination, hands flexing unconsciously as if testing the invisible threads that bound them. They left the house just after dusk, slipping through the backyard gate and onto the overgrown trail that led into Black Hollow Woods. The air turned thick almost immediately, carrying the scent of damp moss and something metallic underneath, like old coins left in rain. The path was narrower than Sarah remembered, branches clawing at their sleeves as they walked single file. The voices hummed along beside them, no longer distant murmurs but a low chorus that rose and fell with their footsteps, guiding rather than chasing. Lily whispered once that she could almost make out words now, names, dates, please, but when Sarah asked her to repeat them, the girl only shook her head, eyes fixed ahead. Grace clutched her mother's hand tighter, the same grip from the photo, and Sarah felt the familiar warmth of skin meeting skin, the lines aligning in that impossible circuit. They walked for what felt like hours, though the watch on Sarah's wrist showed less than 40 minutes. The trail bent unexpectedly, veering off the familiar route toward a part of the woods they had never explored. The trees grew denser here, trunks twisted into shapes that suggested faces half turned away. Then, without warning, the path opened into a small clearing Sarah had never seen. At its center stood a cabin, or what remained of one. The structure sagged under decades of neglect, roof caved in on one side, windows shattered into jagged teeth of glass. Vines strangled the porch rails, and the door hung ajar on rusted hinges, swaying gently as though someone had just passed through. They approached slowly, flashlights cutting pale beams through the gathering dark. Inside, the air was colder, stale with the smell of mildew and something sweeter, like decaying flowers. Dust coated every surface, a broken table, overturned chairs, shelves lined with moldering books whose spines had long since lost their titles. On the floor near the hearth lay scattered papers, yellowed pages covered in faded ink, drawings of interlocking hands, sigils that matched the patterns on their palms with eerie precision. One sheet showed a crude map of the woods, the clearing marked with an X, and beneath it a single line in spidery handwriting: "The chain must close where it began." Sarah knelt, tracing the symbols with a trembling finger. The voices surged then, loud enough to vibrate in her chest, overlapping in a cacophony of urgency. Lily gasped, pointing to the far wall where an old mirror hung crookedly, its surface clouded but still reflective. In the glass, their three figures stood with hands joined, the lines glowing faintly, as if the photograph had come alive inside the frame. Grace stepped closer, breath fogging the glass, and whispered, "It's her." Beyond them in the reflection, a fourth silhouette waited, tall, thin, dripping, watching from the shadowed corner of the room they couldn't see from their side of the mirror. The curse had been waiting here all along, hidden in the heart of the woods, tied to this forgotten place where a desperate act decades earlier had first linked palm to palm, voice to voice, drawing the family inexorably back to complete the circle. The cabin's single room felt smaller now, the walls leaning in as if listening. Sarah, Lily, and Grace stood clustered near the hearth, flashlights trembling in their hands, beams slicing through dust motes that drifted like slow ash. The expert's final report had arrived that afternoon via encrypted email, a dense attachment titled simply, "Anomalous Pattern Analysis, Final." Sarah had opened it on her phone while the girls watched in silence from the doorway. The lead analyst, a man whose credentials spanned 3 universities and classified government contracts, wrote in measured prose that bordered on awe. The interlocking palm lines, when isolated and rotated, formed a perfect unbroken loop, a continuous circuit with no beginning or end. Spectral overlays revealed symmetry so precise it defied random variation. The deviations in one palm mirrored the others with mathematical exactness, as though the skin had been stamped from a single template. But it was the historian who provided the context that chilled them all. He referenced obscure reproductions from 17th and 18th century grimoires, texts like fragments of the Clavicula Salomonis and lesser-known hand-copied manuals passed among Renaissance magicians. In those pages, certain summoning rites demanded a chain of invocation, a sigil drawn not on parchment but across living flesh. Practitioners would join hands in a circle, palms pressed, allowing ink or blood to trace a continuous pattern from one to the next, binding the participants into a single conduit. The unbroken line channeled the entity's voice directly, preventing dissipation into the ether. The hands became the vessel, the skin the parchment, the joint gripped the seal that locked the summoned presence in place. The symbols matched. Not perfectly, time and retouching had blurred some edges, but the core geometry aligned, looping heart lines that echoed ancient barbarous names, fate lines twisting into protective wards, lifelines merging to form the central axis of invocation. The historian noted that such rites were rare, reserved for desperate pacts where the summoner sought not control but communion, voices from beyond answering pleas too urgent for ordinary prayer. The entities bound this way were not demons in the conventional sense, but liminal things, echoes of the departed, restless intelligences drawn from the dark between worlds, hungry for a foothold in the living. One analyst appended a digital reconstruction, the 3 palms overlaid, the circuit glowing in pale blue, rotating slowly like a wheel. It resembled nothing so much as a summoning ring made of skin, the hands themselves the circle, the contact points the gates. The implications settled over them like fog. The photograph hadn't merely captured an anomaly. It had frozen the precise instant of unintended ritual, when Sarah, perhaps laughing, perhaps steadying the girls against a sudden breeze, had pressed palms in a configuration that echoed forbidden patterns from centuries past. The shutter click had sealed it, the film developing the sigil into permanence. Lily traced her own palm with a fingertip, following the faint ridge that now seemed to pulse. Grace whispered that the voices felt older in the cabin, layered, as though multiple speakers overlapped in harmony. Sarah stared at the mirror on the wall, where their reflections held hands in perfect mimicry, the glow faint but undeniable. The curse wasn't a punishment visited upon them, it was a binding they had unwittingly renewed, a chain forged in that long-ago clearing, waiting only for the family to return and close the final link. The night pressed down on the cabin like a physical weight, the moon hidden behind a low ceiling of cloud that turned the clearing into a bowl of shadow. Inside, the flashlights had begun to dim, their batteries protesting the cold that seeped through the cracked walls and floorboards. Sarah, Lily, and Grace stood in a loose triangle near the hearth, hands still joined in the grip that had carried them this far, palms slick with sweat despite the chill. The voices no longer murmured from the trees, they filled the room, a chorus of overlapping tones that vibrated in the ribs and teeth, words finally clear enough to cut. They spoke in layers, the woman from Grace's dreams, her voice thin and waterlogged, pleading for release, older voices beneath her, dry as fallen leaves, reciting fragments of the original rite, and something else, deeper, wordless but heavy with hunger, the thing that had answered the first call decades ago. The air thickened until breathing felt like drawing smoke. Shadows detached from the corners, stretching tall and thin, their edges fraying into tendrils that drifted toward the joined hands as though drawn by the glowing circuit etched into the skin. Sarah felt the pull first, a sharp tug deep in her palm, as if invisible fingers had hooked the lines and begun to reel her forward. Lily gasped, stumbling half a step before catching herself, while Grace's knees buckled. The figures coalesced, 3 of them, translucent, their forms flickering between human outline and smoke. The tallest, the woman from the pond, reached out, her dripping hand hovering inches from Sarah's. Where their palms would meet, the air shimmered, the sigil flaring brighter, blue-white and searing. The voices surged into a single demand: complete the chain. Let the circle close. Give what was promised. Sarah understood then, in the sick clarity of terror, what the pact had been. Not hers, not in this life, but carried forward through the bloodline like an inherited debt. Someone, perhaps a great-grandmother, perhaps further back, had stood in this same clearing on a winter night in 1997, hands pressed to a photograph of her missing husband, begging the dark to speak his name, to bring him back. The thing that answered had taken the husband instead, binding his echo to the family's palms, waiting for the next generation to renew the link. The photograph 5 years ago had been no accident, the alignment of hands, the shutter's click, had been the unwitting renewal, the fresh ink on old parchment. The shadows pressed closer. One reached for Lily, fingers brushing her wrist. She cried out as the line on her palm burned hot, the skin reddening around the pattern. Grace whimpered, trying to pull away, but the grip held fast, the circuit refusing to break. Sarah looked at her daughters, their faces pale, eyes wide with the same dawning horror, and felt the final piece lock into place. To silence the voices, to free the bound echoes, the chain had to close, but not with more flesh. It demanded sacrifice, one life to sever the loop, one palm to tear the sigil apart. The thing waited, patient, its hunger a palpable pressure against their chests, ready to claim whichever hand let go first, whichever voice said yes. The cabin's single room had become a pressure chamber, the air so dense it resisted every breath. The shadows had thickened into forms with edges sharp enough to cut, 3 translucent figures now fully manifest, their outlines wavering between human and something stretched too thin by years of waiting. The tallest, the woman from the pond, stood closest, her dripping dress pooling black water that never touched the floorboards. Her hand hovered, palm forward, the glowing sigil on her skin pulsing in perfect sync with the circuit that bound Sarah, Lily, and Grace together. The other 2 figures lingered behind her, smaller, quieter, their faces blurred as though time had worn the features away. They watched without speaking, patient witnesses to the final act. The voices had coalesced into one overwhelming demand, a single note that rang inside the skull: close the chain. One hand must break the circle. One life to silence the rest. The thing that answered the original plea, the liminal hunger that had taken the husband in 1997 and bound his echo to the family's blood, pressed forward now, its presence a cold weight against the sternum, promising oblivion for whoever stepped into the gap. Sarah felt the burn first, a searing line racing up her arm from the point where her palm met Lily's. The skin around the sigil blistered, red and angry, as though the pattern itself were trying to tear free. Lily cried out, yanking her hand back instinctively, but the grip reformed instantly, invisible threads snapping the palms together again. Grace sobbed once, a small, broken sound, then went still, staring at her own hand where the lines had begun to smoke, thin wisps curling upward like incense. Sarah looked at her daughters, their faces streaked with tears and terror, eyes reflecting the same blue-white glow, and understood there was no other way. The chain could only be severed from within. One of them had to offer the sacrifice, to let go and take the entity's claim, shattering the sigil at the cost of their own life. The alternative was worse. The voices would grow louder, the shadows would claim them all, and the curse would pass to whatever children came after, generation after generation, until the woods swallowed the entire line. She tightened her fingers around theirs, feeling the impossible warmth of their skin, the steady thrum of their pulses beneath the burning lines. The woman from the pond reached farther, her dripping hand inches from Sarah's chest now, waiting. Sarah drew a shuddering breath, tasting mildew and pine and the faint copper of blood. She met Lily's eyes, then Grace's, memorizing the shape of their fear, the curve of their lashes, the way their mouths trembled. Then she began to speak the words the voices had been teaching her all along, soft, rhythmic, the barbarous names that completed the rite. The sigil flared blinding white. The shadows lunged. Sarah felt the pull sharpen into agony, a hook sinking deep into her palm, reeling her toward the dark. She squeezed her daughter's hands one final time, hard enough to bruise, and whispered their names like a prayer as the circuit cracked open, the chain snapping with a sound like breaking bone. The room filled with a rush of cold wind, the voices screaming in unison, triumph, rage, release, as the sigil tore apart, light exploding outward in shards that burned the eyes. Sarah stepped forward into the waiting grasp, her body going slack as the thing claimed what it had been owed since the winter of 1997, the final link dissolving in a burst of freezing silence that swallowed everything.